Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to another Elephant We Don't See Diversity Dialogue. I am Kyla Hanington. I'm the Outreach Coordinator with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. We used to be a Human Relations Commission, but we have been rebranded, so hello from the Office of Human Rights. And I'm super excited to be here again with Michelle, who is my regular companion for this series. And we have a special guest tonight, who is also with the library system. And it is my pleasure to welcome both of you and everybody with us tonight. And I'll just start off by saying, thank you for being our special guest. And we're talking about Pass with Care. And I'm wondering if you could tell the people at home who are viewing a little bit about the book and some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Kyla. I'd be happy to. So I have an e-copy, so forgive me for not being able to hold it up like you guys can. But this is a collection, a memoir by Cooper Lee Bombardier, a bunch of short pieces, both poetry, essays, interviews, both with him and with other people, about his experience as a transgender man coming from working class New England, San Francisco, and New Mexico, and also talking about his experience as an artist and as a person coming from queer art scenes. So before we begin, I'm just gonna, for people who are not familiar with this book or with some of those terms, I'll explain them a little bit. So transgender means a person who is born and does not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is a person who does identify with the gender they're assigned at birth. And queer is the Q in LGBTQ. So that is a term that means a little bit of different things to different people, but it came from in the 80s and 90s, gay people reclaiming a term that was, used as sort of a slur to identify themselves, and was used for people who might not fit into specific categories of the gender or sexuality binary. So it's often used for people who are coming from, who I self-identify, and are coming from an art scene or an underground scene is often where it could be used, although lots of people use it for different things. So I'm really interested in hearing what you two thought about the book and starting this discussion.
So I want to first, one of the things that I've always said is that I struggle with making sure I identify people the way they want to be identified. And it seems like the terminology changes a lot. So what is the best way to know? Because some people want to be identified as queer. Some want to be identified as lesbian. So what is the best way to determine? And I don't know when I would just, have to say, she or they are lesbian, but I just don't ever want to be in a place where I offend. So what is the best way to either determine what to identify someone as or to not identify?
So one thing that I appreciate about this book by Mr. Bombardier is that he's an older queer man. I mean, older in the sense that a lot of queer people might not have. Forgive me. The book identifies him as a queer elder. Okay, I'm talking about. I'm in trouble. He is in a culture that shows us a lot of queer youth and a lot of people in the underground being youth, and in the very real truth that a lot of queer people don't have elders in the traditional sense, either because of familial loss or the AIDS crisis. He is someone who came of age in the 90s, and that can be rare to see in culture because there's just less work published by queer people when he was younger. So, but he does talk about the fact that he can sometimes not keep up with terminology that people use for themselves. And I think using a term like, we at the library use like the LGBTQ plus community, or gender and sexual minorities is a term that is sometimes used, although I don't know, the term minority is also loaded. I think we've all talked about that, if you haven't talked about it specifically in this discussion series. But if someone is close enough to you that you want to speak about them and their experience, I think the best thing to do is to ask, or to ask them to identify themselves in that conversation, in a way that, a one-on-one way, or a way that feels safe. And making space for people to feel safe makes space for people to make that self-identification.
I think one thing that, to your question, Michelle, is that I think one thing that I have thought about, or learned, or lived into, is also not identifying people, is also like not having to give additional details to a person that maybe I wouldn't, like if I'm talking about a woman who's in a relationship with a man, I might not identify the fact that she's in a relationship with a man, as an example. But so just to find those moments when maybe I might feel the need to say, if it's a woman and she has a female partner, that maybe I catch myself wanting to provide that detail, and then being like, well, that's maybe not a detail that I actually need to offer. Like, would I do it if she had a male partner? Like that kind of like self-checking a little bit. And I think just to always point to that, if you know somebody really well, then that's going to probably just be a natural part of your relationship.
Definitely.
I'm thinking more of like working relationships, but so I mean, yeah, if it's a relative or a close friend, then if I don't know, there's a problem. But so yeah, but I'm thinking of, when you are in professional settings and it comes up, but that's my mess. I'd rather know your name that way, because if you told me your name, then I can tell you, I can identify you that way.
Yes. And I think a lot of people in the LGBTQ community feel that way too. Like I feel that way. Like to me, I appreciate someone getting to know me person to person. And, that to me is more important than if they can identify me from seeing me, like as what initial I might identify as.
Right.
And I think the mark of a positive workplace, and not to toot our own horn, but something that I've appreciated about where we are, is by making room for people to, identify themselves with certain pronouns, or having room to talk about different experiences across, the spectrum of folks who we work with. Like there has been room to have conversations one-on-one with coworkers who approach me with positive, open, and curious and loving questions. And not everyone, I think there's actually an interesting quote that I want to share along these lines about sort of the trials and tribulations of visibility, but in working situations that can be professional and also respectful, I think that, there are places to share and places that sometimes people don't want to.
So the book.
Yeah. Let's go.
Pass with Care. So when I started reading the book, I was so confused about what is going on. And so it made me, because I told you I don't like to read a whole lot about the book before reading the book. And very often I'll skip the preface or the introduction or whatever, just so I can get into the book. But this made me go back to the introduction to say, okay, what's happening here? And I'm going to be honest, it wasn't until I hit page 66 that I thought, okay, this is going to be a good book. And it was a quote. It says, as Susan Stryker so eloquently states, gender is a percussive symphony of automatisms reverberating through the space of our bodies before there is an awareness itself. who can say why I heard its music the way I did? And that just kind of touched me, because then I thought of, because early in the book, he's talking about when he was a child and what was happening at that time. And he was going between adulthood and things that happened in the past. And I thought, you know what? That was almost ingenious to write it that way, because for me, it kind of is like, okay, when you don't understand what's happening and then you try to fit into some cultural norms, and families may not accept who you are. It has to be a world that is just in snippets. And I don't know, that just kind of struck me by Susan Stryker. I also, there was something else about coming to an identity of queer wasn't that hard for me. It was a piece of information that clicked into place and clarified things. And so there had to be a point where there was this questioning that caused confusion. And again, you're fighting against cultural norms and fitting in, and where do you fit in? And yet he says it clicked and it clarified things. It made so much of why I felt so different, so off, make sense. That had to be freeing, to know that I get, all of a sudden, I get it. I understand what's happening to me. I know who I am. So from that point on, in 66, from page 66 on, I was like, okay. And I'm going to be honest with you all. I finished it at work today.
Hey,
and Monica said, Michelle, you finished reading the book? I said, no, but my calendar was clear. I shut my door. I pretended I had this major project to work on, because my door's never closed, and I don't feel comfortable with my door closed, because I don't want anybody to think I'm just in there doing nothing, but my mess. But I closed my door, and I was literally able to finish the book and ask myself questions. And I think everybody should read this book.
So I will say, if I can just jump in, I totally love this book. And so for me, it was in a lot of ways a homecoming. It reminded me of my life in the 90s. So I'm guessing that I'm probably a couple of years younger than Cooper. I'm 47 now. Everybody at home, 47, 1973. And I sort of get the... It's a great year, 1973. But I get the impression from the book that he's, in that age range, maybe a couple of years older than me. But this was, my world that I lived in the early 90s. And one of the things, so it was just so familiar. This is my friend group. A lot of these are my own experiences that are very familiar to me. And it, so for me, it was like putting on a comfortable shirt. I mean, I can't even really describe my experience reading this on a personal level. And I was so appreciative for that time period, like sort of the early 1990s, queer space that was so well depicted. And one of the things that resonated with me for today that I sort of didn't expect to discover in anyone else's mind except my own. But Cooper talks about it, which is this sort of disappearing. And he describes it as, he becomes a man and visibly identifiable as a man, and disappears into that male space. And instead of being a visibly queer person, now is an invisible man. And so this and what also I think there's an element, and I think you sort of hit on a little bit, that there's also an age element, that there was this time period, when I'm talking about the 90s and Cooper's talking about the 90s. You're in your early 20s. There's this vibrancy. There's action, the art, and you're sort of like at the start. It feels like you're at the start of a scene, and then you get older, and really sort of bizarrely mainstream. And I think Cooper talks about that, there's a whole part where he talks about how lonely it is to be a man, like just to stand and nobody talks to him, and he's just standing there, and I resonated for that sense of like all of this maybe edgy, and not edgy sounds like an affectation, but I do mean living in a space that's maybe outside of mainstream, and what that means, and how much you just want to be accepted and like normalized. And also when you are accepted and normalized, you sort of disappear, and there is a loss. And I thought that was a very powerful and resonating element of the book for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go on, Michelle.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I highlighted a quote that I want to share that is like probably from the same area that you were sharing. Non-trans people like the born in the wrong body idea because there's a real comfort for them in binaries of understanding that if you're not A, then you must be B. A person must be one thing or the other. Two categories, easily identifiable. The liminal space in between two poles, which comprises a substantial part of a trans life, is very difficult to grasp. I really feel it now as I move through the world in mostly blissful anonymity, read as just a straight white man, the most boring kind of person on earth. A boringness that once scrutinized explodes into a kaleidoscope of historical privileges going back through eons. I feel like an outsider within, a spy in the house of mail. Sometimes I'll go from spy to assassin, at least towards bad ideas that go unchallenged in spaces comprised solely of men.
I was thinking about, it says, I remember reading an ominous anecdote written somewhere by a trans man. You can choose to become a man, but you can't choose the man you will become.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to talk about most of the handful of trans men that I was aware of transitioned to male and then vacated the nest of the queer community. And so that person goes on to live as what society sees as a man, and my language not in this book. So he abandons the community that would be allies for him. But he goes on to talk, but after reading what happened in the 90s to people who were transitioning, I can imagine why you would do that, because it talks about having to pass the real life test. And so literally you go to work one day, perhaps as one gender, and then the next day you show up with how you identify and have to live that way. And can you imagine going back to the 90s, what that could do to an individual, what that would do to the individual's psyche, because you didn't have an opportunity to prepare your colleagues. You didn't have opportunity necessarily to prepare maybe your close friends and your close family, but what does that do to the individual? How does that comfort the individual? And, I worked with someone years ago, and the person didn't have the opportunity to tell his story. Staff announced it and essentially put that person on display. And I was horrified by that, because I was really thinking, how dare you? That was not your story to tell. And because of where that person worked, only the people in that person's office would have known. But now you put it out there, and it was almost like they made that person like an animal in the zoo. And that might have been my foolishness, because that was, I thought, how insensitive, how, and back then there were no HIPAA laws. There was I don't know what there was to protect. And I don't know if that person ever did anything to the human resources person who did that, or said anything, but I thought that was just so insensitive. And I did not know that this real life test existed until I read this book. And I'm so glad that it's not happening unless the person wants that to happen. That should be someone's choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing it was to determine whether or not you could get the sex change, but I think that was a horrible way to do it.
Totally. And so to go back, what you mentioned, the real life test was, and still exists in some, maybe not with that name, but in some trans healthcare, the idea that you had to perform a specific kind of masculinity for trans men to be able to access gender affirming care. So I have one line, or one part of the book that really moved me is he talked about a friend Marco, who was a butch lesbian and who was performing and loved performing, as in like taking on an identity and finding joy in being this sort of hyper masculine, hyper macho, like Tom of Finland drawing of a guy, and then he, in order to try and access trans care, he had to dial back any perceived gayness and have to perform as a specific kind of heterosexual man, non-flamboyant, in order to access that care. And that is, it's hard it's hard to read about, and it's still true. To the range of being able to express masculinity or femininity that a cisgender person would have it's a very specific subset of that can be hyper enforced for trans people who are trying to access care, and that still happens many places.
And I think the very narrow ways of the very narrow. So there's a quote. When you were reading it, made me think of this one. The friend sometimes shakes out tired assumptions about X or Y, like wet wash about to be pinned to a line that only extends in two finite directions. And this idea that, this binary idea of gender, but each of those things being so narrow. And you're describing that, and as it pertains to trans folks, and and I would say that it is just incredible that there are just incredibly narrow definitions of gender.
Yeah,
and
for everyone.
So right, and I mean, and that is not to erase its particular impact on trans and the particular limitation on trans folks. And like I've had this where because I'm like, this is whatever, but I've had, really where I've in the workplace having people be like, you need to have your nails done. And I was like, well, that will literally never happen and has never happened. And have we actually met each other? I'm not sure we've met. Yeah. But I think like that kind of, that there is this, and my guess is that probably would not happen to me in the workplace if I was like, wanted to claim an identity, which is not something that I do of any type. But if I was going to do that, then, probably there would be less pressure. And this is kind of when we think, going back to your question, Michelle, is to what extent do people have, can we create a world in which people do not need to out themselves? And do you know what I'm saying? So can we create a world in which a woman who appears the way that I appear can just exist without you should probably, do something with that hair and do your nails and why don't you ever wear earrings? All of things that I've heard in the work, in not my current, but in the workplace. And it's what would the world be like if there was broader, we could have a broader definition of how people could exist in the world without needing to know, hey, are you non-binary? Are you trans? Or are you cisgendered? Or are you I really think that we love to put people in boxes. Mm-hmm. And in this book and this idea, and I think this is for the people watching at home, because I do realize we are talking to people who are watching at home who maybe haven't read the book yet. One of the things that I think is I want to encourage everybody to read it, as I think you should read all the books that we read in the diversity dialogue. Here's my commercial. They're all super. But I think that really the question is, like, what happens if somebody doesn't tell you what box they fit in? Can they just be in the space with you? Do you have to know? Do you have to categorize and sort them? Or can we just allow people to exist? And I think that is the real challenge, for us in the world in general, is not, and I'm not advocating, please be clear in case anyone's not clear. I'm not saying that I don't think people should identify themselves. However, that if you have an identity that you would like to share that is maybe not obvious, or that you feel like you want to speak about, then by all means do. I think that that's really important. But what about people? Can we exist in space with people without demanding that they do this? That is my question.
Yeah, I think one thing that I appreciated about the book is they talked about that as well. And there's one line that I appreciated. Visibility has become semi-compulsory, and efforts made by individuals to maintain personal privacy are sometimes cast as bad for some imaginary ideal of community. And that goes back to what you said, Michelle, too, about outing and its dangers. I'd like to see the notion of privacy given a fraction of the consideration that the notion of visibility is. So, Kyla, to your point, like, there are certain expectations of a person who is, non-binary or transgender in how they would express. So, if you're to meet a question like, oh, why aren't you, projecting this specific feminine ideal, you shouldn't have to disclose anything to have a specific kind of gender expression or aesthetic expression or anything. And
I think that's like for us, watching, something to just think about is like, how do we relate to people who don't fit a very narrow definition of what we think that person can, like, can we challenge ourselves to just like not care? Yeah, to not think that it is our business, or that we need to know more, or that we need to pass comment.
But that is the society we live in. And as long as you have judgmental people raising children, and they impart their way of thinking and believing on to their children, it's going to continue. I don't think that the world you're talking about, because you're thinking about people whose skin is a darker complexion. They can't do anything about that, so there's no guessing there. And I think it is because society sets the norms. When you see certain people start to wonder, and I guess curiosity, because I really, you are who you are, and as long as you respect me, I'm respecting you. But so many, and I'm gonna say, because I think America is probably the most non-accepting country. I really do. And it's as if everybody feels like they are entitled to know your personal life, and that you have to give an answer to any question that they have. And I agree with you, Kyla. We shouldn't be put in boxes. Stereotypes should not exist, but they do. So how do we move to this place where we can have open and honest conversations with everyone that we meet? And if I ask a question, unless I am completely disrespectful of my question, I can get an honest answer. And then I have to be ready for the answer if the answer is not something I want to hear, because that conversation goes both ways. And I think that we have to do better by setting up better forums for that to take place. And I think that more people have to begin to think at the end of it, no matter how you identify, race, religion, culture, whatever, we all are human beings. We all have blood running through our veins. We all have breath in our bodies. And each one of us has something to offer. And each one of us deserve to be valued. And I don't know that we're ever going to get to that place, at least in my lifetime. But I'm glad we're having conversations like this so that it's not just between friends and others can hear it. Some will disagree with what we say. Some will learn something new. And isn't that the purpose of books? So we can learn something, we can broaden our horizons, we can be enlightened. And then certainly that is the purpose of The Elephant That You Don't See. It is to introduce people to material that may help them change their lives. And become more accepting of people who may or may not be like them. It is troubling to me that we have to have these kinds of conversations. It is troubling to me that as I learn more, I understand that what I think is I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I learned how many transgender people are murdered, and nobody talks about it, where are the allies? Where are the people who stand up for it? It's not in Prince George's County, Black transgender women are being murdered, and I don't see it as a Black woman. I don't see it as a gay person. I see it as somebody's being murdered, and it's happening so frequently, and nobody's talking about it. And why? Why is it because they're Black? Is it because they're trans? What is that? And why is nobody stepping up? And I know that there was a rally not long ago,
Right.
but I didn't even hear about that.
I will
If
say,
a friend had not been participating, I wouldn't have known.
I will say people are talking about it, but you've raised a good question. And I can speak specifically to this because our office did 3 events right after the fact, and one of them was standing room only, and then we did 2 other ones. And there was a Prince George's County trans coalition formed out of those events. And I'm not saying that's a toot our own horn. I don't mean it that way, but the thing is, it is happening. We've had county council members involved. We went to the town of Fairmont Heights. We've worked with various things. If that is not somehow trickling out, we're not getting the newspaper coverage, that may be a different issue. But I do think it is important to know that this is happening and people are talking about it. People are talking about it and trying to, create and make resources. What do we need to do? And this is maybe a question. This is maybe a question for outside of this, but I think it's, if the experience is that it's not being talked about, then that is another issue, which is what is it that we are doing? And I mean that whether it's our office or us collectively or the library or these county council members or the Prince George's County Trans Coalition or all of these various groups that are working, what is it that we are doing or not doing that is not getting the word out to folks? A, this is happening. B, we're responding. C, we want to and are creating resources, and there are things available. And maybe, and then to have this be about the book, I think that you just hit on something though, which is this sense of invisibility all the time. And I don't think that this is a new experience. What you've just described, that this feeling that people, and I mean, we are all people, so I guess that means us, but that people do not care about the trans community. And I have been hearing that and been part of that world. And seen that for decades. So what is it that we can, as individuals, and this is kind of what I was saying for people listening at home, like what's something that you can do, or how do we check our bias, or can we challenge ourselves to like not need to know, and those kinds of things, because I truly believe that the only power I have is over Kyla Hanington. I wish I had power over everybody else, but I don't. So, but that's true for all of us as individuals, right? And if all of us as individuals decide to behave a certain way, or to care about something, or to take action about a certain issue, I mean, that is how the world gets changed. And what is happening is for trans folks and I think this is going back to what I was saying about this part where Cooper feels that he has disappeared, and so he was somebody who's active and has been involved, heavily involved in community, and like has written this memoir and like,
yeah,
I've run out of words. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's interesting because we say the LGBTQ plus community, or whatever way you want to refer to a group of, gender and sexual minorities, but those are very different experiences. And the trans experience is different across the board. It is, for some people it is an identity, and for other people it is a process of getting to a place where that no longer has to be their identity. And so I think recognizing that the trans community is not just hyper visible people, but also people who might fly under your radar. And again, like what you and Michelle said, like having privacy and allowing people to live their truth and not have to be a poster child. And of course, like it has meant the world to be involved in Prince George's Pride and PG Samuel's Pride, and to be able to talk about the complicated, challenging, painful, and joyful history of this community and its celebrations in America. But it's also to be, and I know that anyone of like any experience of, outside of the straight white cis norm knows that it can be fatiguing to, like, visibility can be fatiguing, and to be able to just be a person is a liberating experience for everyone. When personhood is ascribed to a very specific subset of people.
Yeah. There's a part where Cooper writes, can my male authorhood tell my story of a gender non-conforming girlhood where the accepted community language of this current moment did not exist? And I was thinking about that as it relates to, as we're talking about identity and shifting identity, or speaking or not speaking identity, or how we view the people around us, trying to slot them into this, that as language changes and as the world changes, I mean, like it's changed a lot. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot to go with, but as a lot farther to go. But I look at like the 80s versus now, and the early 90s versus now, and think, man, there's a world of possibility that, if you could go back in time to like 1990, it would not be it would be beyond imagining. And when you look at this book and this story, and for those of you who are watching, and I hope that you do choose to read it, one of the things that Cooper wrestles with and talks about is this idea that, and I think you quoted this already, this supposed to be this very tidy linear movement, and that somehow this memoir will be a tidy linear movement from, girlhood to manhood, and it'll all be in this nice little row, and then everything's like a little bow around it, and that's not the memoir, but that's also not the experience. It's not binary.
And I think, people across gender identities and people outside of transgender identity can understand that too. One thing that I loved about this book is that he talked about people in his life who had detransitioned or moved back to, identifying as the gender they did at birth. And he also talks about talking with a younger person who is kind of rolling their eyes at him, and like his identity and where he's at, and there's a line he said, maybe in 2037 we won't even call it transitioning anymore. My trans curmudgeon status might be here to stay, but I realize the kid's expectation for kind helpfulness is a result of trans suffering in the halls of institutionalized medicine, and that his outrage can and will become part of a collective lever that ratchets our broken system to a new and better place. So, the idea, even like looking at my I'm 31, so I was in high school in the early 2000s, and the people I know who identified as trans the one person I knew who identified as trans in high school was institutionalized, pretty much for being difficult, aka being trans, and that is, it's worlds away now. I couldn't imagine the kind of kids and acceptance I'm seeing now, but that also what comes with that is a very like all visibility, like comes with, there's a stereotype of what trans might look like, knowing exactly who you are when you're born, and that's I know you guys have talked about it before, the double-edged sword of visibility, and just making space for all different kinds of expressions for all people, and the reality of shifting identities is, I don't know, I found that very powerful in this book. And in the discussions that you two have had outside of this book.
And and I think that he says something. It's on page 200. And I think it is something that no matter who we are, it's something that we all seek. And his transformation gave him peace. And it says here, it was a process by which I made peace with the body, to make friends with the mind, to be able to sit still inside this skin, being in my body, making peace with the fact that this is the reality of my body, rolled the stone away from the mouth of the cave of my empathy. And, I think many of us struggle to make peace with the mind, because back to what I was saying earlier, society puts so many norms. These are the societal norms. And no matter who you are, if you don't fit within that category, I think, and much of it is around body, whether it is the color of your skin, the shape of your body, who you believe yourself to be, because it just, you struggle. The body and the mind don't always agree. That's where insecurities come in. That is where, in some cases, people, and he alludes to it, commit suicide. It is a struggle constantly. And my guess is, had he not made the decision, it could be that he'd be in a mental institution. It could be that he would have committed suicide. It could be that he would have destructive behaviors. You don't know. And I think that is the one thing that we all have to strive for. We have to strive to make peace with the mind, and to be friends with our minds.
Not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some powerful little things in this book. There really were. But I think the other thing that this book does, it lets you know that this was not an easy decision to come to. It lets you know that this journey is different from everyone. So you can't look at all trans people and believe that their journeys were the same. You cannot, and as you mentioned, because I think the person was Z, and Z was to it was I think Z was transitioning to be a man, and Cooper fell in love with Z as a man, and then was hearing rumors about what was happening to Z, and then Z transitioned back to a woman. And can you imagine? Can you just imagine how Z struggled? You know, I also know of someone who started the process and then ran out of money, couldn't finish the process. And so it's, it just, what does that do to the psyche? So, you know, none of the decisions I think are easy decisions. It is not like, um, you know, something that you can change or just come to. I don't know. I think if you, and because I have not walked in these shoes, but I just imagine that if I was struggling with who I believed myself to be, and I couldn't change that, um, and I couldn't tell anyone what I was going through. And I felt like I was alone in this world. I was not only that I couldn't tell anyone, I was afraid to tell people, for fear of my life, for fear of acceptance, for fear of being ostracized. Whatever, I'm in this world alone. Um, you know, you lose your mind. And I think that that is essentially what he said, he was coming to. And he had to get to a point where he had to make peace with himself. And it's one thing to, I think, again, now I haven't walked in these shoes, and so I hate to say, but I just, it's one thing to know that I'm gay. But then to know that I don't think I'm in the body that I should be in. And coming to that, and then knowing the history that's happened to people who what if I didn't know anything, didn't know where to go, because how easily are those resources available? I hate the fact that there may be people who are struggling. So I think if nothing else, we need to, at the library, have resources available, and even on our website, to say, if you're struggling, here's some places you can go, here are places you can go to talk to people, so that you are not traveling in this world and in this environment alone. It just bothers me that someone may have that kind of struggle, and you can come talk to me about anything, but that's one thing I'm not going to be able to help with. You can tell me, and what we can do is sit down and find some resources, but to tell me I can't help because I don't know enough. And I don't know, that's troubling to me. That is really troubling to me.
And I think that's one of the things that's so wonderful about community, right? And that there is to find the space where your people are at. And by your people, I mean people who support you and who get you. And, going back to my early 90s experience, one of the things that was so great for me was realizing, you can be in queer spaces and there's people of all different political stripes and all different, people are not all one thing. And that's true of every group of people. And yet that there can be this symmetry, because although for all those differences, this understanding of being in that space. And I think to be able to find community is absolutely life-saving. It is life-saving to find community.
Yeah. Yeah. But, how welcoming is that community when because there's something in here that leads me to believe that in that community, trans isn't necessarily accepted all the time.
Well, that's something, I know we're reaching the end and want to address some audience questions, but I like, every time you guys talk, it's like, we can go forever. I'm always like, no, don't get up. But one thing that resonated with me personally is that Cooper, when Cooper identified as a woman, he identified as a woman of lesbian experience. And when you guys talked about I am woman, there was a quote in there talking about how lesbians, like the idea of lesbianism is women loving women, and that transcends just sexuality, but supporting women and the just being a woman who loves and centers women in one's life. And the idea that Cooper shared was the idea that leaving womanhood or expressing other parts of his gender identity would be a betrayal of lesbianism and of womanhood. And as someone who, like, some of my strongest role models are women, hi mom, and I was raised in the feminist tradition, and that has always meant the world to me. I resonated a lot with that that feeling. But I think that idea of womanhood as something that would be damaged by a single person choosing to move away from it, that's rooted in a very specific idea of womanhood, especially white womanhood, that is damaging. Womanhood is something assailable and something that must be protected. And that comes out, this is, outside of the book, but something that I think is important to point out. That's expressed a lot right now with the issues about trans youth that we see in the news a lot, and that in other states are a real issue. There are two main issues, and I think they're very enlightening about how we approach womanhood as a country. The idea that trans women, or people who were assigned male at birth who are transitioning and identifying as female, that those people in women's sports will push out women, biological women, and the idea of trans girls as monstrous and some sort of superhuman level of strength that could never be matched by a biological female. And on the other side is the idea that girls are catching, and Cooper talked about this in the book, like young girls are catching this social contagion of transness, and they are jumping into these surgeries and mutilating their bodies. And so both of those the idea that biological girls, quote unquote, are hurting themselves, and biological boys who identify as girls are hurting them. Both of those center this toxic and hurtful idea of womanhood, again, that is like rooted in this idea that white womanhood needs to be protected, and it's not liberatory for anyone.
There's a part Cooper has, and I think as you go back to the sense of like maybe losing community or maybe being less welcome in community, where I hate the sense of scarcity that pervades our trans community, the way we are always holding our sharpest knives up towards each other. And I think that and I think my experience has been that there are many different communities and marginalized communities in which people in those communities would say that they've experienced the same thing, that it's like this, that sometimes like the people that you need to be most in your corner are the people who would be the quickest to pull you down. And I think that, the highlighting, he highlights that the scarcity mindset, which obviously we know where that comes from. So actually, let me just really quick. We're almost out of time. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. And YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. I am doing my job. We got a couple
comments. We'll share them at the end.
I just looked at the
time. It's all good.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I can't remember what my thought was now because I was like, wait, I have another job. But I think and I guess it goes back to the question that for ourselves, for us as individuals, like, what is it that we can do in our own lives and space that and we're specifically talking about trans folks. So like, what is it that we can do that supports, elevates, lifts up, strengthens, provides community, that is expansive, and supportive in our, families, in our neighborhoods, in our county, because that also will shifts away from that scarcity mindset internally, because it's not scarce, because there is love and abundance and all of this goodness and space. And I think that to me is always when we do these, when I do love doing this series, Michelle, and special guests. Like, I'm so glad that we do this. And I love all of the people who tune in, and we've got these wonderful comments, again, and I'm like faithful viewers. But I think the challenge for me when we do these, it's always about, okay, well, what is it that what's my takeaway, and how can I put this into meaningful action? And I think when it comes to trans folks, and this is what the book got, where I really felt connected with the book, and it's sort of this dichotomy thing, which is needing to be accepted and sort of therefore normalized, and also recognizing the painful invisibility that can come with that, which I think was very, at least for me, really, really resonated and was really relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Big question.
So did we get any questions?
Yeah, we had a couple comments here. Michelle H. said, forums like this can help even well-intentioned, unevolved, persons begin to challenge their narrow paradigms of gender.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say that I think from this this series of conversations, and from conversations on the whole, like, we all have growth, and we all see the biases that come towards us, and we can't, we all have growth to do. So might be a little heavy-handed.
Right.
And Susan Roberts said, these books and these conversations make these people visible and these worlds real. I'm so grateful for the work you do to make this available to me.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you.
Susan's been wonderful. I'm always happy to see you at events. Susan is to Office of Human Rights what Miss Vivian is to the library. And I'm so grateful. But I'm so grateful for the interest and the involvement, right? That's what I wish that everybody was, without we, as if we had the world full of Miss Vivians and Miss Susans, right?
Yeah.
Involved and interested and engaged. It's just so awesome. So that's one thing. I mean, I love being able to do this with Michelle and special guests. And so, I'm so glad that you were here, and all the people who tune in. This is what we do. I mean, it's all y'all at home that we're here for. So thank you guys for all being here.
Definitely. Thanks, everyone. Anything, any closing remarks, anybody, on the book before we get to the real closing?
Well, I mean, I really recommend it. It's very specific, as Michelle pointed out, that Cooper says, like, it's about one person's experience. It's not the story of every person, but it's so interesting. And I think I found it, I loved it.
Yeah. And for me, it was, how you just think, okay, somebody is transitioning. Okay, no big deal. They're going to get some medicine. They may have some surgeries. They're going to get some hormones. And I never thought about the psyche or what's happened to lead up to that. It was just kind of like, okay, I made a decision. And duh, I know that nothing like that could be made so easily. But this book just opened my eyes to the history, and what's still happening today, and the fact that even within the community, that isn't even necessarily a safe space. And so it just makes me want to be a better human being, to learn how to be an ally, and to be more empathetic. And I'm not saying that I was never not empathetic, just not a full understanding, I guess. And maybe put some compassion to the empathy, I guess, is what I just want to be better. That's
something I know we have to stop talking, but sometimes something I think about a lot from listening to your past discussions, and is the allyship across intersections of oppression is a process, and it's work, and it's not an identity. You know, it is something that we have to be doing all the time. And you know, your thoughts and your reflections on what compassion and allyship mean. That's a big deal, you know.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all so much for this conversation. Thank you, Michelle and Kyla, for having me. It's a joy to be here, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness and so much. I want to recommend everyone check out this book. I will put it up here. You can check it out on our website, pgcmls.info, pgcmls.overdrive.com for the ebook. You can go to loyalty bookstores, tinyurl.com/pgcmlsloyalty to purchase the book. I'd also want to recommend that you check out our upcoming events with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. That's tinyurl.com/PGCHRC events. Let me put that on the bottom of the screen. We have some really awesome stuff coming up. On July 13th at 7 p.m., we have 2 generations of blind African Americans, Denna and Arthur Ray Lambert, on the legacy of segregated schools for the blind. That's going to be awesome. July 14th, Ken Woodley is in conversation about the road to healing. And July 20th, I am so excited for this one. Kendra Allen is going to be in conversation about her poems in the collection plate, the collection called the Collection Plate. So we have some really awesome stuff coming up. And if you check out pgcmls.info/pride, you can find links to resources, book lists, things like this, and things that are more accessible if you're looking for somewhere to begin. So thank you again, everyone. Happy Pride, happy Tuesday evening, and be well. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh.